At the RUSI of New South Wales, we have endeavoured to deliver our lunchtime lectures online while our presentation venue, the Anzac Memorial Sydney, has been closed and other COVID-19 restrictions have applied. Our thanks to Institute member Lieutenant Colonel Peter Sweeney RFD for providing us with this quality presentation. There is more about Colonel Sweeney at the end of the presentation.
The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was one of the many battles fought along the north coast of Papua New Guinea in World War II. It's significant, this particular battle, because it prevented the Japanese from reinforcing their forces as MacArthur continued to advance east to west along Papua New Guinea. Described by Lex Macaulay in his book The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, that it was 30 minutes that changed the balance of power in New Guinea. It was a battle for the land forces, it was fought at sea, but it was won by the air forces of both America and Australia. Where are we? We're in the Bismarck Sea, which, as you can see, is between New Britain and New Guinea. Most of you will be familiar, of course, with the battles around Buna and Gona, and Buna is shown there. And further along the coast is Lae. So the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was in the Southwest Pacific area. Aircraft from the United States Army's 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force attacked a Japanese convoy which was taking troops to Lae. Most of the Japanese force was destroyed and the Japanese troop losses were particularly heavy. I propose to discuss the battle by way of the lead-up. What were the Japanese plans? What intelligence did the Allies have on Japanese intentions? We'll look at the opposing forces, we'll look at what the Allied plan was, and we'll look at the first attacks carried out by the Allies and then the subsequent attacks, and we'll look at the aftermath of the battle. In the lead-up, Japanese forces withdrew from Guadalcanal in early 1943, and at the same time, of course, the Australians had succeeded in pushing the Japanese back along the Kokoda track to Buna and Gona. And of course, the first defeat of the Japanese on land was by the Australians at Milne Bay. And integral to that, of course, was the integration of the RAAF and the Army headquarters. And the force there was able to repel the Japanese attack and force them, in fact, to withdraw. The first time in World War II that the Japanese had failed to achieve a strategic objective. The ultimate goal, of course, was to capture the main Japanese base, which was on Rabaul on the island of New Britain, which, as you saw, is to the north, on the other side of the Bismarck Sea. And so, of course, MacArthur was very keen to return, and so he saw this as a stepping stone for the eventual reconquest of the Philippines. The Japanese, of course, perceived the threat and continued to send land, naval, aerial reinforcements to the area to check the Allied advances. So the Japanese plans were to reinforce their position in the Southwest Pacific area. And you can see there the Bismarck Archipelago, you can see the Solomon Sea, Moresby, and all the other key locations within Papua New Guinea, including Lae, which had an airfield, of course. Rabaul is at the top of the island of New Britain. So the plan was of the Japanese was to move some nearly 7,000 troops from Rabaul to Lae. Allied intelligence on the Japanese plans were that they detected the preparations for the convoy, and as well as that, the Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, which was a combination of Australian signallers and Americans who had been evacuated from the Philippines, as code breakers, were able to decrypt a coded message that the Japanese had sent, showing or telling of their intentions to land convoys not just at Lae, but also Wewak and Madang, a little further along the coast. The opposing forces, the Japanese convoy was made up of 8 destroyers, 8 troop transports, an escort of some 100 fighter aircraft, and it set out from Simpson Harbour at the end of February in 1943. The US Air Force had 3 bombardment groups made up of Flying Fortresses, Liberators and Mitchell bombers. The aircraft there's some details as to crew and bomb load. The Mitchell was a much lighter bomber, as you can see, but both the Flying Fortress and the Liberator carried a substantial payload in bombs. The RAAF had at Milne Bay a squadron of Hudsons, 2 squadrons of the Kitty Hawks and a squadron of Beauforts. At Port Moresby there was a squadron of Wirraways, a squadron of Boston and a squadron of Beaufighters. Again, you can see there the bomb loads and crewing and armament generally that the aircraft in the RAAF carried, much less by way of weight than the American bombers. And you can see there that it could carry, the Beaufighter and the Beaufort could carry either bombs or mines or in fact a torpedo. So the Allied plan was in fact to undertake an all-out assault on the convoy to prevent the Japanese reinforcing that part of the Southwest Pacific area. Critical in that was the planning by RAAF Group Captain William Bull Gehring, who had in fact played a particularly important role in the defence of Milne Bay in that combined headquarters that I mentioned. He was a well-known character and personality in the RAAF, and he envisaged that large numbers of aircraft striking the convoy from different directions and different altitudes with precise timing would in fact destroy the convoy. Reconnaissance aircraft would of course detect the convoy. The longer range US Army Air Force bombers would then attack. But once the convoy was in range of the Allies' potent anti-shipping aircraft, I've already mentioned Beaufighters, Bostons, Beauforts for the RAAF, and Mitchells and Bostons from the US Army Air Force. It would be a coordinated attack carried out at medium, low, and in fact very low altitudes. And tactics were developed. One was skip bombing, in which the aircraft would fly very close to sea level, that the bombers would release the bombs and the bombs would ricochet across the surface, similar to the tactic employed in the bombing of the dams in Germany. It would explode at the side of the ship, under it, or in fact just over it. And so that shows you there the aircraft coming down, dropping the bomb, and it's skipping and hitting the side of the ship. Mast height bombing was another tactic. They'd approach the target at a low altitude, so above sea level, but only 200 to 500 feet, at about 270 miles an hour. They then drop down to the mast height of the target ship at about 600 yards from the target, and they would release the bombs at around 300 yards, but aiming directly at the side of the ship. And so there you can see a mast height bombing. You can see the height of the bombers as they approach the target. The first attacks on the 1st of March, a patrolling B-24 Liberator heavy bomber spotted the convoy, Subsequently, flying fortresses failed to locate the ships. On the 2nd of March, a force of some 6 RAAF Bostons attacked Lae, occupied by the Japanese, and that was to reduce its ability to provide support to the convoy. Then the convoy was located, and B-17s attacked the ships over the next hour. And they attacked with the 1,000-pound or 450-kilogram bombs at a height of about 5,000 feet. The attack was successful. One of the transports carrying 1,200 army troops was sunk, and 2 other transports were damaged. 8 Japanese fighters were destroyed and another dozen or so damaged. The further attacks were Bostons from number 22 Squadron RAAF attacked the Japanese fighter base at Lae, which of course denuded the Japanese's ability to provide air cover to their convoy. And those attacks continued throughout the day. Further attacks on the 3rd of March, some dozen B-17s bombed from a medium altitude of about 7,000 feet, which caused the ships to manoeuvre and disperse, which of course denuded their concentrated air anti-aircraft defensive firepower. A B-17 broke up in the air. The crew took to their parachutes. The Japanese fighter pilots machined some of them in the air as they were descending and attacked others in the water after they had landed. 5 of those Japanese fighters strafing the B-17 were engaged and shot down by 3 Lightnings. B-25s arrived, continuing the attacks on the 3rd of March, and again released 500-pound bombs from somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, caused Japanese vessels to collide in the confusion caused by the attack. And of course, those bombing runs left the ships separated and vulnerable to both strafing and masthead attacks. 13 Beaufighters from number 30 Squadron RAAF approached at a low level to give the impression that they were actually Beauforts making a torpedo attack. The defence, of course, by the ships was to turn and face the bombers, because if they were releasing torpedoes, then the torpedoes would be bow on to the ship. But of course, they were not torpedo bombers. They were going to strafe. And of course, a ship head on to a aircraft with machine guns was the perfect target. And again, you have further follow-up attacks on the 3rd of March, and this was a combination of American bombers attacking at mast height, as we saw earlier. They were given intelligence that there were hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors who had survived the attacks on the 3rd of March, but of course had abandoned their ships, and so were either in lifeboats or in fact floating in the ocean in the Bismarck Sea. The Allies had to prevent them from getting ashore and reinforcing Lae. And so they continued to attack the survivors who were just floating in the Bismarck Sea. You can see there 8 Japanese transports were sunk, along with 4 destroyers, 20 aircraft, and up to some 7,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed. Allied losses were minimal, with 4 aircraft and 13 airmen being lost. Such was the success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea that the Japanese decided that they could not send strongly escorted convoys without air superiority. But of course they were unable to establish that air superiority against the Allied forces which I described earlier. And because the Japanese were unable to reinforce or in fact resupply their troops based in Lae, then they were then permanently put on the defensive, which of course opened the door for the subsequent successful Allied campaigns, particularly along the north coast of Papua New Guinea. The famous Australian combat cameraman Damien Parra actually accompanied the RAAF. You will see Parra sitting behind the pilot of one of the aircraft, and he was able to capture some of the scenes which you saw earlier in regards to mast height bombing. And here is some of the footage from Parra's newsreel.
The greatest victory in the history of air-sea warfare focused the world's attention on the Bismarck Sea. Word was flashed that a Japanese armada was heading towards New Guinea. Warning had been coming in of huge enemy ship concentrations at Rabaul. Up to 60 ships had been observed there and bombed by Allied airmen. The convoy began moving in on Lae and Salamaua during a tropical storm. It lifted and the invasion fleet was spotted. The Allied Air Command snapped into action. In operations room, well-laid plans for a coordinated attack were brought into play. The first moves in what was to prove the biggest aerial show in the Pacific was chalked up. The word scramble sent Australian and American crews racing to their planes. More than 130 aircraft taking part in a wholesale massacre of a Jap convoy. Kitty Hawks, Cobras, Lightnings, Bostons, Beauforts, Fortresses, Liberators and Beaufighters. Every available plane is sent up. Not a single enemy transport or warship survived the great Allied onslaught. Beaufighters. It is from one of these that the cameraman takes his vivid pictures. A Lockheed Lightning. Over the coastline and up into the blue where the USAAF and RAAF are massing for battle. The Bismarck Sea stretches below. The first wave of bombers is already catching the enemy fire. Successive formations are sent in at a low level and the harvest is in full swing. Columns of smoke sprout up as one after the other the Jap vessels are written off. Cannon fire sprays every deck and superstructure with devastating effect. Already more than half of the invasion fleet is accounted for. Although it's a 2-day job to sink the lot, the shark-infested sea is already filling with burning hulks, bodies and floating wreckage. 22 enemy ships, their crews and 15,000 Jap soldiers perish in this holocaust from the air. We have achieved a victory of such completeness as to assume the proportions of a major disaster to the enemy. General MacArthur was able to pen those words when his jubilant American and Australian flyers did that to Admiral Tojo and flew back to complete their reports. Fighter pilots also had a day out. They had shot the Zeros out of the sky. They came back with victory rolls for breakfast. It's been a great day for the Yanks and Aussies. 55 Jap planes destroyed, as many more heavily damaged, and the whole convoy of 22 ships annihilated. Chalk that up. There's another thing which mustn't be overlooked. Comradeship between the Aussies and the Americans, which is best described by themselves.
It was a cracker show from beginning to end. When it comes to a scrap, we Aussies don't want any better coppers than you Yanks. We're tickled to death to know that you're right behind us.
Oh yeah, Blackjack? With you, boy, not behind you.
Well, all kidding aside, the results obtained cannot be attributed to any one individual or a group of individuals. It was more like a smooth play on a football field. Every man knew his job and every man did his part. The coordination between the RAAF and the American Air Forces was really perfect.
The cooperative spirit. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea has its counterpart in North Africa. Great air forces fighting side by side.
That was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It was absolutely crucial to the Allied success in New Guinea and enabled, of course, MacArthur to advance on to the Philippines.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Sweeney, RFD, retired, has been a member of the Institute since 1968. A military historian and member of the United Kingdom-based International Guild of Battlefield Guides, he holds a Master of Military History from the University of New South Wales, a graduate diploma in Management, Defence Studies, a diploma in Accounting, and is in partnership with fellow Institute historian Lieutenant Colonel Ron Lyons in the battlefield touring company Battle Honours Australia. He is a noted presenter to community groups on Australian military history and travels from time to time on cruise ships as an enrichment speaker on naval, army and air force history.